Hi guys, welcome back. We are on chapter 5, page 72, and when we left off, she had thrown up all over Jehu-Scudder, the first mate on the ship. All right, chapter 5, or A Cheerful Countenance. A true lady is ever cheerful, Miss Hepplewhite liked to say, but I was having a hard time being cheerful in the face of Mary's fevered moaning. I was terribly worried. Several days had passed, and the rat bite on her arm was now oozing a putrid yellow pus. Angry red welts streaked up to her neck. I remembered a patient of my father's, an orphan child, who'd been bitten by a rat and later died. "The darn creatures make disgusting wounds, Janie," Papa had sighed at the time. Just thinking of him made me wish he were here, although our parting had been strained. He had given his permission, but never his blessing. I summoned the ship's surgeon. "I could lop off the arm," Sturgis offered. He belched loudly, and the cabin was suddenly redolent with the smell of whiskey. It was rumored that he drank the liquor intended for his patients. I shuddered. "Well, do you want me to lop it off?" Sturgis barked. I looked at his bloodshot eyes and wondered at the wisdom of letting the man near Mary. He wasn't any class of surgeon that I could tell. One thing was certain, I was determined that Mary would not lose the arm. "No," I said. "There's always puking." Many physicians believe that having a patient puke removed the bad poisons from the body. But as we had spent most of the voyage puking, I hardly saw the value in this remedy. I can honestly say that puking has done nothing to improve her health thus far. "Then I reckon we could bleed her," he said, rubbing his hand through his greasy hair. Little white flecks fell to his shoulders. I remember Papa's feelings on bloodletting. Sturgis picked up a knife and bared Mary's pale arm. The blue vein beneath her skin seemed so frail. "No bleeding," I said firmly. "We can lance the wound." I hesitated, casting a suspicious eye at his dirt-encrusted fingernails. "I shall do it." Sturgis belched again. "You?" "Yes," I said, pulling myself up. "My father's a surgeon." He shrugged and stepped aside. I took one of Sturgis's knives. I was thankful that Mary was in a swoon. "Know what you're about there, girl?" Sturgis asked skeptically. "Yes, of course," I said quickly. It wasn't exactly the truth, although I had learned quite a bit from watching my father before I'd entered Miss Hepplewhite's school. I had seen Papa lance any number of boils. It was not unlike carving into a rotten apple that had been left too long in the sun. So lancing a wound would be like if you had a section that was raw or, infected, it would be like cutting it out. So if you think about if you had an apple and there was like a big dark mark in it, you could cut that section out. So that's what she's thinking about, is where the rat bit, it's infected and it's covered with pus, and then her veins are streaking up to her neck. So she's planning on cutting out the infected section of the arm. Yummy. I sliced gently into the inflamed wound, and the smell of rotting flesh filled the cabin. Believe me when I say that I very much wanted to rush outside and get sick, but I imagined Papa standing there with a rueful grin on his face. "It's dirty work helping sick people," he would say, "but it's even dirtier work burying them." I swallowed hard and steadied my resolve. I used my best needle and a piece of silk thread to stitch it up. Mary's face was waxy and she didn't stir. "There," I said, meeting Sturgis's bloodshot eyes. "Not bad, girl. You're good with the needle." I looked at Mary's arm. The stitches were straight, small, and neat. I could almost see Papa's proud smile. "Well done, Janie," he would have said. "Well done." "Thank you," I said with a shaky smile. I had a good teacher. Father Joseph agreed to watch Mary while I went above to get some air. I was exhausted from taking care of her, and worse, I was frightened. What if she didn't recover? It would be all my fault. The sky was just beginning to turn a dusky pink, the salty air bracing. I looked out at the ocean, at the endless rolling waves, and wondered wildly if we would ever reach Shoalwater Bay. Would we ever be off this ship? My childhood dreams of sailing seemed very silly now. The only thing that made this long, dreadful trip bearable was the knowledge that William was waiting for me at the other end of it. I clung to this thought even as I clung to the rail. Captain Johnson was stomping about, shouting out orders. He caught sight of me and roared, "What are you doing up here, lassie?" I shook my head wordlessly. The captain scared me fairly to death. "Well," he hollered. I'll take responsibility for her, sir, a voice behind me said. It was Jehu Scudder. He met the captain's gaze with steady eyes. The captain grimaced and then wandered off, no doubt to shout at some other poor soul. Thank you, I said in a low voice. Jehu nodded. Heard from Sturgis that Mary's taken a bad turn, he said. Think she'll make it? It seemed somehow worse hearing him give voice to my worry. I thought of Miss Hepplewhite's advice to always be cheerful. I'm sure she'll get better, I said, forcing myself to smile. He looked at me carefully, as if he didn't quite believe me, and then nodded shortly and stared out at the water. I suddenly felt nervous to be standing here, unescorted, with this strange man. I struggled to remember Miss Hepplewhite's advice on such situations. Rules of Conversation, Chapter 2, had much to say about how to properly request the salt or discuss the latest play, but I didn't recall it mentioning how to converse with a sailor. Have you been to Shoalwater Bay before? I asked finally. He shook his head. Nope, first time for the captain and me. We'll be taking on timber. It was just my luck that I was on a ship with a captain who had never been where we were going. We are not lost, are we? I asked suspiciously. Have no fear. We're on course by the wind. This was hardly consoling. I had many fears, and now chief among them was the captain's ability to get us to our destination in one piece. Will we ever arrive? I asked, exasperated. He looked genuinely surprised. We're making good time. The lady's a fast girl, one of the fastest brigs to come out of Philadelphia in a while. In fact, Samuel and I have a bet. A bet? The number of days it will take to get us from Philadelphia to Shoalwater Bay. What is Samuel's opinion? Jehu surveyed the cloudless sky, tilting his scarred cheek to catch the ocean breeze. Samuel thinks she's a lucky ship, and that we'll make it in 180 days, including our stops. And you? He grinned. I believe in luck myself, but I also believe in spring squalls. I reckon we'll sight Shoalwater in 190 days. If Samuel were right, that meant we were less than a week away. It couldn't be soon enough for me. I looked out at the waves. My father has this foolish saying. He says you make your own luck. He's right. I thought of Sally Biddle and that rotten apple. Well, I don't agree. I've been plagued by bad luck since I was 11. He looked at me steadily. Maybe it's time you did something about it. I retired below to check on Mary and relieve Father Joseph of his duties. She was awake. Are you feeling better, Mary? I asked, pushing the hair off her forehead. Her head was cool, I was pleased to see. The fever was gone. Mary smiled faintly through chapped lips. Well enough, considering you've been practicing your stitchery on my arm, Jane, my girl. You should be thankful I didn't embroider a violet on it, I teased. She giggled, and I felt immediately better. She would be fine after all. Perhaps we would finally both get a decent night's rest for a change, I thought as I tugged my woolen nightdress over my head. The door banged open, startling us both. I snatched up a shawl. I imagined it was probably Father Joseph returning to give us another sermon about the savages, but it was not. Jehu Scudder stood in the doorway, holding a tureen. I brought something for Mary, he said, shortly stepping inside. He was so tall and broad that he had to crouch to get into the small cabin. Mary was in her bunk, covers up to her chin, but I was in plain sight, wearing only a woolen nightdress and a shawl. Most shockingly, my stocking-covered ankles were clearly visible. Quickly, I tucked my feet beneath the hem of my nightdress, lest Jehu see them. The words rose in my throat to tell him to leave, that it wasn't at all proper for him to be in our cabin when we weren't properly dressed. But before I could say anything, he pulled up a chair as if he meant to stay. Here, he said, passing me the tureen. I sniffed at the broth to make certain it wasn't bilge water, but it smelled deliciously of chicken. It's a miracle the cook made something decent, I said. Cook didn't make it. I did. You did? I was shocked. He tilted his head in acknowledgement. In the shadowy light of the lantern, his scar seemed less visible, and I suddenly realized that he had bright blue eyes. Strange that I had never noticed his eyes before. And there's no horse meat in there, I promise, he added, smiling. He looked less fearsome when he smiled. I spooned the broth into Mary's mouth while she observed us through slit eyes. The cabin was as silent as our parlor when I was a young girl and practiced listening well. Miss Hepplewhite always said it was a lady's obligation to encourage good conversation when in polite company, but I was having a difficult time considering Jehu polite company, for all that he had brought the broth. Moreover, I could not help feeling conscious of my ankles. Even William had never seen my stocking-covered ankles. At last I spoke. Where did you learn to cook? He shrugged. On ships, I suppose. Been at sea since I was Samuel's age. If you want something good to eat, you best make it yourself. First lesson I learned. Oh, He looked at me. And you? Are you a good cook? I hesitated, then shook my head. We always had Miss Parker. He nodded. Was that a flicker of disappointment in his eyes? And of course, Mary is a very fine cook, I said quickly. She is planning to open a boarding house to make her fortune when we reach the frontier. Aren't you, Mary? Mary made a small sound. So, Miss Peck, will you spend your days on the frontier if you won't? How will you spend your days on the frontier if you won't be cooking? He asked. I bit my lip, momentarily perplexed. I suppose I'll embroider? Embroider, eh? He looked at Mary dubiously. Yes, embroider, I said firmly. There's a big demand for needlepoint cushions on the frontier then, is there? Now there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Amusement? From her bunk, Mary chuckled quietly. She was most certainly feeling better. Jehu took a deep breath and stood up. Well, Miss Peck, if you want my advice, you might want to ask Mary here for some tips on cooking and the like. I shrugged as if unconcerned. I'm sure William has already employed a maid and a cook for us. Jehu squinted at the two of us. For your sake, I hope so. Although Mary was better, she was still weak. Not long after Jehu left, she was snoring lightly, so I took the opportunity to undo my braid and give my hair a good brushing. I was working on a particularly frustrating snarl when Jehu banged on the door and barged into our cabin for the second time that evening. Jehu stared at my hair tumbled loose around my shoulders, a strange expression on his face. It was most improper for a man to see a young lady with her hair unbound, almost as bad as seeing her bare ankles. Do you ever knock? I demanded. You should try rum. I beg your pardon. New England rum, it's good for the tangles. I felt myself go red. Was there something you required? I asked stiffly. Jehu remembered himself. We're sailing straight into a storm, batten down everything and stay below decks. And then he disappeared as quickly as he had come. In short order, the ship began rocking wildly, and we were soon joined by Father Joseph and Sturgis. It seemed that their cabin was taking in water. The wind rose to a keening howl, and the Lady Luck began careening with frightful violence, side to side and up and down. The screeching wind drowned out the shouts of the sailors above deck. The lantern swung wildly as the ship tilted to and fro, casting fearful shadows in the small cabin. Mary was pale as a wraith, and Father Joseph's eyebrows twitched madly as he clutched the table with real terror. Only Sturgis was unaffected by the rough seas, no doubt because of all the whiskey in his belly. This is a witch of a storm, all right, Sturgis slurred, slumped in a corner, nursing his bottle. Jane, my girl, Mary croaked weakly, do you think we'll make it to this blessed Shoalwater Bay? A true lady is ever cheerful. Yes, of course, I said brightly, although fear was racing up and down my spine. Then, without warning, something smashed into the ship with such force that I went tumbling from my chair onto the floor. It felt like a whale or some huge sea monster had struck us. I struggled to right my chair against the rocking of the ship. Even Sturgis paled. That didn't sound good. Sweet dew, have mercy on your children, Father Joseph whispered, patting his forehead nervously. The door to the cabin flew open and Jehu's slick face appeared. He was soaking wet. Come on, man, he shouted to Sturgis. Samuel's been hurt. And then he was gone. Samuel? I thought in horror. Jane, my girl, Mary said hoarsely. She was thinking the same thing I was. Sturgis was too drunk to be of help to anyone, let alone sweet Samuel. Sturgis lurched drunkenly to his feet. I pushed him back down. What are you about, girl? He demanded belligerently. Stay with Mary, I said firmly, and was out the door before he could argue. Shall I ever forget the sight that met my eyes? The screaming men, the pelting rain, the way the angry black waves seemed to reach from the very depths of the sea, like giant hands trying to drag the ship down. A flash of lightning struck the ocean, illuminating the deck for one long, terrible moment, and I saw at once the cause of the horrible sound. The mainmast had been struck by lightning. So the mainmast, if you're thinking of the ship, it's the one that's the very, very tallest pole, and it holds the big sail. So the mainmast would be the highest one. It's struck by lightning, and it's fallen over. And it would be a very massive, heavy beam of wood. So it would be very, very dangerous for that to get hit by lightning and break. The mainmast had been struck by lightning, and the topsail yard had crashed down to the deck in a tangle of rigging, sailcloth, and splintered wood. The heaviest chunk had landed horribly on Samuel. Deckhands were swarming about, brandishing knives, trying to free the boy. The ship tipped and I went tumbling to the deck. I pushed myself to my feet and rushed over fallen debris to Samuel, grabbing his hand. "Oh, blast," I whispered, taking in the sight, my heart lurching sickly. A piece of wood was stretched across the boy's belly, pinning him down, and blood gushed down his head. So much blood. He looked up at me with blank eyes. "Mama," he said. There was a dazed expression on his face. Someone was shaking my shoulders. "Where's the blasted sawbones?" Jehu shouted, his face slick with rain. "He's drunk! Don't you have any sense? It's dangerous up here. Get below now," Jehu shouted in a frustrated voice, the scar on his cheek twitching. "I can't just leave him. It's an order." Miss Hepplewhite said a young lady was obedient in all things, but all I could hear was Papa saying, "A doctor never abandons a patient in need, Janie." "I'm staying," I yelled. Jehu's lips thinned in a harsh line. He nodded shortly. He turned and shouted to 2 men to come take hold of the yard. Samuel clutched my hand. "Mama," he asked anxiously. I sank to my knees and put his head in my lap, brushing the hair from his face. "Yes, Samuel, it's Mama," I said, trying to sound cheery. The blood from his head was a spreading bloom on my skirt. "Everything's going to be just fine." My presence calmed him, and he settled in my arms. "Heave now!" Jehu shouted, his face to the wind. And as the yard lifted, the boy jerked awake for a moment, his eyes bright with pain. Then he sighed and closed his eyes, resting his head on my lap as gently as if he were falling asleep, his eyelashes dark, wet spikes on his soft young cheeks. "Samuel!" I cried, but he didn't stir. Jehu looked at me with dark, unfathomable eyes. "I'm sorry, Jane." So Samuel just died. I know. Sad. I struggled back to the cabin, hair plastered to my face, soaking wet and shaking. The first thing I saw was Father Joseph's black robe back. He was kneeling next to Mary's bunk, praying. "What are you doing?" I whispered. Sturgis roused himself. "The girl fell from the bunk when we tipped and struck her head. I couldn't do anything for her." "What?" The word tumbled from my mouth, spoken by some other girl, not me, not Jane Peck. "She's dead, mademoiselle," Father Joseph said, shaking his head sadly at me. "No," I whispered, wiping my hand across my face as if to wipe away the sight. "She can't be. I was only gone for a moment." "I'm sorry, mademoiselle," Father Joseph said, an eerie echo of Jehu's words. I looked over at the bunk, at Mary's white face, at the blood matting her thick black hair, her dark eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling, and all I could do was stand there. The wind and the rain sprayed through the door, and the lantern shook crazily. It seemed easier to just be, to let the storm beat upon me, scream at my back, howl in my ear. "We must pray for her sins," Father Joseph urged. The priest leaned forward to touch Mary's forehead, and the sight of him touching her white skin shook something inside me, something so deep that it stabbed my very soul, and I screamed, "No!" I screamed and screamed, my voice rising with the wind, flying out the door, disappearing into the dark night, as if the word alone could bring her back, bring back her merry eyes, her laughing smile, her laughing mouth, her warm heart, bring back Mary Hearn, a sweet girl, a good cook, a lively companion, the finest brusher of horrible, ratty, tangled red hair in all of Philadelphia, my only true friend in the whole world. Tears ran down my cheeks as Jehu Scudder came running into the cabin, knife drawn. "What is it?" Jehu demanded. "The girl's dead," Sturgis shouted over the wind. "Ain't my fault." A cold fury rushed through me. I couldn't stand the sight of him. "I left her with you," I howled. "Why didn't you keep her from falling? Why couldn't you do something useful for a change instead of drink?" I flung myself at Sturgis, hair flying. I wanted to kill that careless, heartless man. I wanted to rip his eyes out with my own 2 hands. But I was weeping so hard that I could barely see, and Sturgis was tumbling back in surprise, and Father Joseph was shouting at me, and the next thing I knew, someone grabbed me around the waist and hauled me back. "Jane," Jehu said grimly, his arm tight around my middle. "There's nothing you can do." The fury went out of me in a rush, leaving me limp with grief. "If I had just stayed," I cried brokenly, weeping into his chest. "If I had just stayed." Jehu said nothing, just rubbed his hand down my back soothingly. his fingers tangling in my hair like Mary's brush. We stood there in the doorway, and I wept and wept while the wind and the rain pounded in through the dark, terrible night. And then there's a little break, so a little time. I sewed the burial shrouds out of sheets meant for my marriage bed. My stitches were straight and perfect. Miss Hepplewhite would have been proud. We buried young Samuel and Mary at sea beneath the same blue wave. So the burial shroud would have been she sewed 2 sheets together, kind of like a sleeping bag, and sewed it shut instead of a coffin, and then they would bury them at sea. So intense chapter. We have Samuel that died, and then Mary is dead. She's gone. So now Jane is completely on her own with no companion for the rest of the trip. They're very close, though, luckily. We're going to stop there, and I will see you again for chapter 6. Thanks for joining.